When I first met Nora, I was 28 and she was 32. Our relationship started off beautifully. For the first 2.5 years, we were open about being together, sharing photos and reels on Instagram from our vacations and dinners. It felt natural, sharing our joy with the world. We were proud of each other, and our relationship was no secret. Nora didn't have a huge social circle on Instagram, just about 7 or 8 close friends and a cousin. But those friends were her world. I respected that, and I never intruded. We were both mature adults, and after talking it over, we decided to get married the following year, sometime in November or December 2024. I figured it was time for her to meet my family. So a month ago, with her consent, I introduced her to my parents at a nice restaurant. My family liked her immediately. They were so happy they wanted to set a wedding date right away, but Nora felt it was too soon. After some discussion, we settled on February 2025, just 6 months later. In our city, you need to book wedding venues early to avoid last-minute issues, so I took Nora's approval and reserved a hall. A few days later, she did the same for her side of the family. In our culture, it's normal to have separate celebrations for the bride and groom. So far, everything seemed to be on track. She had met my family, and I had introduced her to one of my closest female friends who lived in another town with her boyfriend. The meetings had all been respectful, planned, and smooth. There was even one accidental run-in with another friend of mine at the mall, but nothing too serious. However, I hadn't formally met any of Nora's friends. The closest I came was when I drove her somewhere, and 2 or 3 of her friends joined us for a quick ride. We exchanged polite words, but that was it. Even so, they all knew we were dating. Then something strange happened. Last week, I received a message on Instagram from one of her friends, Mia. The only time I had spoken to Mia before was over a year ago during a rough patch in my relationship with Nora. Back then, we had a fight, and I reached out to Mia to ask if she could talk to Nora for me. She seemed understanding and agreed, but when Nora found out, she was furious. She told me to never contact her friends again, and I complied. I figured she just needed space. Shortly afterward, Mia blocked me on Instagram. I let it go at the time, assuming things would settle down. But now, Mia had messaged me again, unable to reach Nora, and worried about her. I assured her that Nora was probably just busy with work and promised to pass along the message. When I called Nora and mentioned Mia's concern, she was immediately irritated. "Why does she have to text you?" she snapped. "Block her right now." Her request seemed childish and unreasonable. I told her I wouldn't block Mia for such a trivial reason. In response, she said that if I didn't block her, Mia would do it herself. A few minutes later, I was blocked again, this time by Mia. It made me angry. I felt like I was being treated unfairly for no reason. In a moment of frustration, I messaged Mia through her other Instagram account. I kept it civil, saying, "Hey, how are you? I don't appreciate being blocked like that. It's disrespectful." I added that if her husband had any self-respect, he wouldn't contact Nora if they were having issues. Mia shot back, "My husband and I have been in her life way before you ever came along." I tried to clarify that I wasn't trying to ruin their friendship. I just wanted to understand why I was being treated this way. She didn't respond and instead told Nora what I had said. Nora was livid. She accused me of crossing a line by mentioning Mia's husband. I didn't see what I'd done wrong. I was serious about Nora. I had introduced her to my family, and we were planning a future together. But the way she acted, it felt like she wasn't as serious about me. She claimed her parents were dead, and she didn't have close family, but her friends were supposed to be there for her wedding. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't let me get to know them. We were going to be married in 6 months, and these were the people who would help her plan everything. It seemed only logical to get acquainted with them, but every time I brought it up, she shut me down. She kept saying that her ex-boyfriends had caused problems with her friends in the past, and she didn't want history to repeat itself. I understood that, but it felt like an excuse. We were well beyond the point of casual dating. We were engaged. Why did she still want to keep me away from her closest friends? This latest blocking incident weighed on me. I brought up how her friends' husbands joined group gatherings sometimes and asked if I could join too. She refused, saying she'd only introduce me to them after we were married. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 days. The silence between us was heavy. When I finally brought it up, she accused me of being controlling and said she wasn't sure about marrying me anymore. I was stunned. Was I wrong for wanting to meet her friends? Wasn't that a normal part of preparing for a life together? I didn't know what to do, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get worse. The silence between Nora and me stretched longer than I expected. It was strange to go from planning a wedding to barely speaking at all. I spent those days replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where things went wrong. Was I really being controlling? Or was I just asking for something that any fiancé would want? I kept thinking about how she had introduced me to no one from her life. My family and friends had welcomed her with open arms. They saw her as someone who would soon be part of our family, someone we'd care for and support. But with her, it felt like I was stuck on the outside, always looking in. After 2 days, I finally gave in and texted her. My message was simple: we need to talk. She didn't reply right away, but a few hours later, my phone buzzed. Come over. We'll talk. When I arrived at her apartment, the air was thick with tension. She opened the door, her expression unreadable. I stepped inside, and we sat on the couch, an invisible wall between us. I took a deep breath. Nora, I don't understand why you won't let me meet your friends. We're getting married in 6 months. Shouldn't I be a part of your life by now? She sighed, avoiding my gaze. It's not that simple, Leo. My friends are important to me. I don't want anything to ruin those relationships. But I haven't done anything to ruin them, I said, my voice soft. I just want to know them, the same way you know my family and friends. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with frustration. My ex-boyfriends caused problems with my friends before. They made things complicated, and I lost people I cared about. I don't want that to happen again. I leaned back, trying to stay calm. But I'm not them, Nora. I've never given you a reason to think I'd mess things up with your friends. I've respected your boundaries, even when they didn't make sense to me. She shook her head. You say that now, but what if things change? What if you start interfering, asking questions, or judging them? Her words stung. I'm not trying to judge anyone. I just want to be included. We're supposed to be a team, Nora. If you can't trust me with your friends, how are we supposed to build a life together? She was quiet for a long moment. I'm just scared, she whispered finally. I've been hurt before. I don't know if I can handle that again. I softened. I get that, but shutting me out isn't the answer. Trust goes both ways. I need to feel like you trust me too. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm trying, Leo, but it's hard. I reached for her hand, and she let me take it. I'm here for you. I want to understand, but I also need to feel like I belong in your life. Right now, it feels like there are walls between us that shouldn't be there. She nodded slowly. I'll try to introduce you to them after the wedding. I pulled my hand back gently. That's not good enough, Nora. This isn't just about the wedding. It's about trust and openness. If you can't let me in now, what's going to change after we're married? Her face hardened. So what are you saying? That if I don't introduce you to my friends now, you'll call off the wedding? I hesitated. I'm saying that if we can't solve this now, I don't know how we'll move forward. Marriage is about partnership, about knowing each other completely. I don't want to marry someone who keeps me at arm's length. She stood up abruptly. Maybe you're right. Maybe we're not ready for this. My heart sank. Is that what you want? I don't know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I need time to think. I nodded, my chest tight. Take the time you need. I left her apartment feeling hollow. The person I loved was slipping away, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. I wanted to be understanding, to give her space, but how much was too much? How long could I keep holding on before I lost myself in the process? The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, my mind constantly drifting back to Nora. We didn't talk. The silence between us felt permanent now, like a chasm we couldn't bridge. My parents noticed something was off, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I tell them that the woman I was supposed to marry didn't trust me enough to let me meet her friends? Then came the message that changed everything. It was from a mutual acquaintance who lived in Nora's hometown. Hey, I thought you should know. I saw Nora's mom today. She's alive and well. I stared at the message, my mind reeling. That couldn't be right. Nora had told me her mother was dead. She had cried about it, shared stories of grief. There was no way she could have lied about something like that, right? But deep down, a cold dread spread through me. Something hadn't felt right for a long time, and this felt like the final piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. I knew I had to see for myself, so I got in my car and drove to her hometown, my heart pounding the entire way. When I finally arrived and knocked on the door of the small house she visited every few months, a woman opened it. She looked exactly like the photos Nora had shown me of her mother. She was alive, she was real, and everything I thought I knew about Nora came crashing down around me. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the woman in front of me. She was older, probably in her early 60s, with soft eyes and a familiar smile. The same smile I'd seen on Nora countless times. "Hello," she said gently. "Can I help you?" For a second, I couldn't speak. My mind was scrambling, trying to process what I was seeing. Finally, I managed to say, "I'm Leo. I'm Nora's fiancé." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh," she said, her voice soft. She paused, then stepped aside. "You should come in." I hesitated, my heart pounding, but I needed answers, so I stepped inside. The house was small and cozy, filled with the scent of something cooking on the stove. It felt warm, lived in, a stark contrast to the cold secrecy I'd been dealing with. We sat down in the living room. I looked at her, searching for the right words. "Nora told me you were gone. She said you died." She sighed, her face clouded with sadness. "I know. I've known she's been telling people that. I don't understand why she does it. I've asked her, but she never gives me a straight answer." A wave of anger and confusion crashed over me. Why would she lie about something like that? We're supposed to get married in 6 months. I thought I knew her. I trusted her. She shook her head. "Nora has always struggled with certain things. She doesn't like to let people get too close. It's like she builds walls to protect herself, even when it doesn't make sense." I leaned forward, my hands clenched together. "But why lie about you? About her own mother?" Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I think she's afraid of being hurt again, afraid that if people know too much, they'll leave her. She's lost people before, and it changed her. I wish she would trust someone. I wish she would trust you." I felt a lump in my throat. I want to be there for her. I love her. But how can I marry someone who keeps such huge secrets? Someone who doesn't trust me enough to let me in? Her mother nodded sadly. "I wish I had an answer for you, Leo. I've tried to help her, but she's stubborn. She thinks she can protect herself by keeping people at a distance, but she only ends up hurting the people who care about her." The pain in her voice mirrored my own. We sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then I stood up. "Thank you for talking to me," I said quietly. I needed to know the truth. She walked me to the door. "Take care of yourself, Leo," she said softly. "And if you can, try to understand her. She's not a bad person. She's just scared." I nodded, though my heart felt heavy. "I'll try." I got in my car and drove back home, my mind spinning. Everything felt like a blur. The road, the scenery, the noise of traffic. All I could think about was Nora and the lies she'd told. I tried to make sense of it, to find a reason that would make it all okay, but nothing fit. When I finally got home, I sat on my couch, staring at the wall. I felt drained, empty. I didn't know what to do. I loved Nora, but love wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to be full of secrets and half-truths. A part of me wanted to call her, to demand answers, to ask her why. But another part of me was just tired of trying to break through her walls, tired of being kept at a distance. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Nora. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I didn't know if I was ready to face her, but I owed it to myself to try. I typed back, "Okay, come over." An hour later, she knocked on my door. When I opened it, she looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes red and puffy. She stepped inside, and we sat down in the living room, the silence stretching between us. Finally, she spoke. "I know you went to see my mom." I nodded. "Yeah, I had to." She took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Leo, I really am. I didn't want you to find out like that." "Why, Nora?" My voice cracked. "Why did you lie about her being dead? Why all the secrecy?" Tears streamed down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see how messed up I am, that you'd leave." I felt a surge of sadness and frustration. "Nora, I've been here for you through everything. I introduced you to my family. I was ready to marry you. I wanted a life with you, but you didn't trust me enough to let me in." She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I don't know how to fix this." I leaned back, my heart aching. "I don't know if it can be fixed. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. You've lied to me about so many things. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now? She looked at me, desperation in her eyes. Please, Leo. I love you. I want to make this right. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. I love you too, Nora. But love isn't enough if there's no trust. I need honesty. I need to feel like I'm a part of your life, not just someone you keep on the outside. She didn't say anything. She just sat there crying softly. The silence felt final. I knew deep down that this was the end. As much as I loved her, I couldn't keep fighting to be let in. I deserved more than that. We deserved more than that. I think we need to take a break, I said quietly. We both need time to figure things out. She nodded, her face crumpling with pain. I understand. She stood up, and I walked her to the door. We stood there for a moment, both of us knowing this was goodbye. Take care of yourself, Nora, I whispered. You too, she said, her voice breaking. She walked away, and I closed the door behind her. The emptiness was overwhelming, but deep down, I knew it was the right choice. I needed to heal. And maybe so did she. The days after Nora left felt like walking through a fog. The silence in my apartment was suffocating, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn on the TV or listen to music. Everything reminded me of her. The scent of her favorite candles still lingering in the air, the photos we'd taken together on vacations, even the half-empty bottle of her favorite tea in the fridge. I tried to stay busy, hoping that work would distract me. But no matter how many hours I spent staring at spreadsheets or sitting in meetings, my mind kept wandering back to her. I wondered if she was okay, if she missed me, if she regretted everything that had happened. At night, sleep became a battleground. I'd lie awake replaying our conversations, our arguments, all the moments that led to this. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, tempted to text her, but each time I stopped. I knew that giving in to that urge wouldn't help either of us. My parents tried to check in, their voices cautious. They didn't want to say, I told you so, but I could feel it in the pauses between their words. They had always been wary of Nora's secrecy, and now it felt like their concerns were validated. I didn't blame them, but it made me feel even more alone. One evening, my mom called and said softly, Leo, you don't have to go through this alone. We're here for you. I know, Mom, I replied, my voice thick. I just need some time. After we hung up, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all. My heart ached with a kind of grief I hadn't known before. This wasn't just a breakup. It was the shattering of a future I'd planned so carefully. All those dreams of marriage, of building a life together, were now just dust. I started thinking about what went wrong, not in a self-pitying way, but to understand Nora's fears, her walls, her lies. They all stemmed from something deeper, pain she hadn't fully shared with me, wounds that hadn't healed. I wanted to believe that if I had tried harder, loved her more, things would have been different. But I also knew that love alone couldn't fix everything. One night, about a week after we decided to take a break, I went for a long walk. The city lights glowed softly, the streets humming with life. I watched couples holding hands, friends laughing, and people rushing to wherever they needed to be. I felt both connected to them and utterly separate, like I was watching life happen through a window. I ended up at the little park where Nora and I used to sit on lazy Sunday afternoons. The bench where we once shared ice cream and silly conversations was empty now. I sat down, the cold metal seeping through my jeans. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the good times. Her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about things she loved, the quiet moments when everything felt perfect. Despite the pain, I couldn't hate her. She was flawed, yes, but so was I. We had tried, and maybe that was enough. As I sat there, a familiar ping broke the silence. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart sinking when I saw her name on the screen. Nora, I hope you're okay. I've been thinking about everything. I miss you. I stared at the message, a flood of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, sadness, longing. I missed her too. But I knew that missing someone wasn't enough to rebuild what we'd broken. I took a deep breath and typed a response. Me. I miss you too, Nora. But we need more than that. We need trust and honesty. I don't know if we can get there. Her reply came quickly. Nora, I know. I'm trying to figure things out. I want to be better. For you. For us. I closed my eyes, my chest tightening. Part of me wanted to believe her, to jump back into her arms and pretend everything was okay. But the rational part of me knew that we needed more time. Maybe she needed to heal on her own before we could ever hope to heal together. Me, take your time. I hope you find what you're looking for. There was a long pause. Then she sent one final message. Nora, thank you, Leo. I hope you do too. I pocketed my phone, a strange sense of calm settling over me. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Maybe this was how it was supposed to be. Two people who loved each other but needed to find their way separately. As I walked back home, I realized that letting go didn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it meant giving both people the chance to grow, to heal, and maybe, just maybe, find their way back to each other someday. Or maybe not. Either way, I knew I'd be okay. The weeks that followed felt like a slow unraveling. Each day, I woke up feeling a little less weighed down by the past. The grief was still there, but it no longer consumed me. It was like an old bruise, tender when pressed, but no longer debilitating. I focused on myself for the first time in years. I picked up hobbies I'd neglected, reading books that had been collecting dust on my shelves, going for long runs that left me breathless but alive. I spent more time with friends who reminded me of who I was before everything got so tangled. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself at the local farmer's market. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of fresh bread and flowers. As I wandered through the stalls, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. I wasn't thinking about Nora, about what could have been. I was simply there, in the moment. At a stand selling handmade candles, I picked up one labeled lavender and bergamot. It was her favorite scent. A familiar pang hit me, but it was softer now, almost nostalgic. I set the candle back down and smiled. Some memories were meant to stay just that, memories. On the way home, I stopped by a cafe I used to love. I ordered my coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world go by. The cafe buzzed with life, people chatting, laughing, lost in their own stories. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was ready to write a new chapter of my own. I thought about everything that had happened. Nora's lies, her fears, the walls she'd built around herself. For a while, I'd carried the weight of those things, wondering if I'd failed her, if I'd failed us. But now, I saw it differently. Sometimes, people are just carrying more than they can handle, and no amount of love can lighten their load until they're ready to set it down themselves. I'd loved Nora, and maybe part of me always would, but I also realized that love shouldn't feel like a constant battle to be included, to be trusted. Love should be a partnership, a place where both people feel safe to be themselves. And we hadn't been able to give each other that. As I sipped my coffee, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from my friend Mark. Mark, hey, we're all heading out to the lake tomorrow. You in? I smiled. The lake had always been our place, a spot to unwind, to laugh, to just be. It was something I'd avoided while I was with Nora, always too worried about leaving her out or making her feel uncomfortable. But now, I felt a pull toward that easy, uncomplicated joy. Me. Yeah, I'm in. See you there. The next morning, I packed up my gear and drove to the lake, the sun shining through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the road. When I got there, the familiar sight of my friends greeted me. Mark, his wife Julie, and a few others I hadn't seen in months. They waved me over, their smiles warm and welcoming. Leo, Mark called out. Thought we lost you for good. I laughed, shaking my head. Nah, just needed to find my way back. We spent the day kayaking, swimming, and lounging on the shore. The laughter came easily, the conversations flowing without effort. It felt like a part of me that had been asleep was finally waking up. As the sun set, casting the lake in hues of gold and orange, I sat by the water's edge, the gentle waves lapping at my feet. For the first time in a long while, I felt whole. I wasn't clinging to what had been or fearing what might come. I was just here, and it was enough. I thought of Nora then, not with anger or regret, but with a quiet understanding. I hoped she was finding her own peace, her own way forward. Maybe one day our paths would cross again, or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I wished her well. The journey we'd shared was over, but my own journey was still unfolding. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready for whatever came next. Story 2. My name is Alex, and I'm 20 now. When I was 8, my parents decided they were done with me. They packed my bags and sent me to live with my Aunt Linda. Even back then, I knew they didn't really like having me around. They were in their early 20s when they had me, and their lives seemed more like a struggle than a celebration. I guess I was just an obstacle to them. Looking back now, it's obvious they resented me, but at the time, I couldn't figure out why they were so cold. I spent most of my childhood trying to earn their love. I behaved. I tried hard in school, but no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Behind closed doors, they were distant and indifferent. But in public, they'd put on a show of being caring parents. If I ever tried to tell anyone the truth, they'd intimidate me into silence. I stayed quiet because I didn't want them to hate me even more. The emotional neglect took a toll on me. My grades slipped, and I acted out in school. The teachers would complain, and my parents would scold and punish me. But deep down, I knew my bad behavior was just a desperate attempt to get their attention. When I was being good, they ignored me. When I misbehaved, at least they noticed I existed. My plan to misbehave backfired when my mom got pregnant again, just before my 8th birthday. Suddenly, they were thrilled, happier than I'd ever seen them. They announced the pregnancy during my birthday party, but instead of being happy, I felt confused and anxious. I sensed that something was about to change, and not in a good way. A few weeks later, my mom was packing my things while my dad sat me down and explained that I was going to live with Aunt Linda. They claimed they wanted what was best for me because I was struggling at home, but I knew the truth. They were making room for the new baby. I was being replaced. I was devastated. I cried and begged to stay, promising to do better in school, to behave, anything to make them change their minds. But they were resolute. They didn't care about my tears or my promises. In their eyes, I was already gone. The journey to Aunt Linda's house was the longest, most miserable trip of my life. I felt like my entire world was crumbling. I didn't want to leave my home, my school, my friends, even my parents. As terrible as they were still my parents, and the thought of being sent away from them was unbearable. When we arrived at Aunt Linda's, my parents stayed just long enough to help me settle in. Aunt Linda, my dad's older sister, was kind and gentle. She never married or had kids of her own, and she worked the family farm everyone else had long since left behind. She saw how upset I was and reassured me that everything would be okay, that I'd grow to love it there. Her warmth was the only thing that made those first few days bearable. When my parents left, I fell apart. Aunt Linda tried calling them so I could talk to them, but they rarely answered. I spent weeks crying, feeling abandoned and alone. Aunt Linda never left my side. Slowly, her kindness helped me heal. After a few months, something surprising happened. I stopped missing my parents. Life with Aunt Linda was peaceful. I helped on the farm, went to school, and things just started to click. Schoolwork wasn't as hard anymore, and I even made friends. The teachers liked me. I realized I was doing better without my parents in my life. Every holiday, when we'd see each other, the feeling was the same. I was better off without them. Aunt Linda told me my parents had said I was a troubled child who needed a change. One night, I told her the truth. They had never wanted me. Her expression hardened, and after that, she grew distant toward my parents too. We saw them less and less at family events. Over the next 12 years, they barely made any effort to know me. I didn't mind. I was happier without them. Life with Aunt Linda turned out to be everything I never knew I needed. Her farmhouse, nestled among rolling fields, felt like a world away from the cold, stifling atmosphere of my parents' house. The air was fresh, the mornings were quiet, and for the first time, I felt like I could just breathe. It wasn't just the place. It was the way Aunt Linda treated me. She spoke to me like I mattered, like my thoughts and feelings had weight. I helped her on the farm, feeding the animals, fixing fences, and planting crops. The work was hard, but it made me feel useful. My hands were busy, and my mind finally had room to think. Each day ended with dinner at the big kitchen table, where Aunt Linda would ask me about my day and listen to my answers like they were important. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to me. School was different too. The teachers were kind, and the other kids didn't look at me like I was a problem to be solved. I stopped feeling like I had to prove myself all the time. Slowly, my grades started improving. I wasn't a perfect student, but I was doing okay. And that was enough for me. Every now and then, my parents would send a check, but it was barely enough to cover anything. Aunt Linda never complained. She picked up the slack without a word, always making sure I had clothes that fit and food on my plate. Sometimes she'd get quiet after hanging up the phone with them. I knew she was holding back her anger, but she never let it touch me. She shielded me from all the bitterness and hurt they left behind. We settled into our own rhythm, and with each passing year, my parents felt more and more like a distant memory. They stopped visiting entirely, even during the holidays. I didn't mind. The silence from them was easier to handle than their empty promises or fake smiles. Aunt Linda was my family now, and I was content. As time went on, I heard bits and pieces about my sister, Emily. She was growing up to be the child my parents thought they wanted, or so it seemed. From what little family gossip trickled back to us, Emily was a handful. She was rude, spoiled, and had a way of getting into trouble that made my childhood rebellion look tame. I didn't know how to feel about her. She was just a baby when I left, an innocent bystander in the mess my parents created. Sometimes I wondered if she was just another victim of their warped idea of parenting. Other times I couldn't help but feel a sting of resentment. She got everything I ever wanted, their attention, their resources, their time, and yet she was still lost. By the time I was 18, I had a plan for my life. I was going to college to study business so I could help Aunt Linda run the farm. The school was close enough that I could come home every weekend. It was perfect. My world felt stable, something I never thought I'd have. But of course, nothing stays quiet forever. One weekend, while I was home, the phone rang. Aunt Linda answered and her face clouded over. She held the phone out to me. "It's your parents," she said softly. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. It had been nearly 12 years since I'd had a real conversation with them. Part of me didn't want to take the call, but curiosity got the better of me. I took the phone and pressed it to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice more steady than I felt. "Alex," my mom's voice crackled through the line, fake warmth dripping from every word. "It's so good to hear your voice. We're so proud of how well you're doing." I didn't know how to respond. Proud? Of what? They hadn't been part of my life for over a decade. After a bit of awkward small talk, they finally got to the point. "We want another chance, Alex," my dad said. "After you finish college, we'd love for you to come back home." I blinked. "Come back?" I repeated, confused. "Why?" They hesitated, and then the truth spilled out. Emily, the golden child, the one they kept, was a mess. More than that, she was a public embarrassment. They wanted me to come back so they could show everyone they were capable of raising a successful child. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They didn't want me. They wanted the idea of me, the proof that they weren't failures. A cold, hard anger settled in my chest. "No," I said, my voice low and firm. "I'm not coming back. I'm not going to help you pretend to be something you're not." They tried to argue, but I didn't hear them. I handed the phone back to Aunt Linda and walked away, my heart pounding with a mixture of fury and relief. That call changed everything. My parents weren't sorry for what they did. They didn't care about me or the years they'd missed. All they cared about was appearances. And I wasn't going to be part of their twisted little show. For the first time in my life, I felt free. After that phone call, I felt like I had finally shut a door that had been creaking open for years. But even with the door closed, my parents still found ways to scratch at it, trying to pry it open again. The days that followed were full of relentless messages, different phone numbers, new email accounts, all filled with the same desperate pleas and manipulative guilt trips. They wanted me to reconsider, to think about family, to remember who I am. But I knew exactly who I was. I was someone who had survived without them, someone who had found his place without their help. Aunt Linda reminded me of that every time she looked at me with pride and love in her eyes. One evening, after dinner, Aunt Linda sat with me at the kitchen table. The warm glow of the old pendant light hung between us, casting soft shadows on the walls. I could see the worry etched into her face. "You're doing the right thing, Alex," she said gently. "Don't let them make you feel otherwise." I nodded, but a part of me still felt a twinge of doubt. They were my parents. After all, I wasn't sure if standing my ground was strength or stubbornness. She seemed to read my thoughts. Sometimes standing firm is the hardest thing to do. It doesn't mean you're being cruel. It means you know what you deserve. Her words settled in my heart, grounding me. I realized that my parents' opinions no longer defined me. I didn't need to carry their expectations or failures on my back. I had my own life, my own path, and I wasn't going to let them pull me off it, but my parents weren't giving up. One afternoon, I was back at the farm when Aunt Linda's phone rang. She glanced at the number and sighed. "It's them again," she muttered, handing the phone to me. "You decide what to do." This time, I was ready. I took a deep breath and answered, "Alex, it's your mother." Her voice wavered, trying to sound soft and vulnerable. "Please, just listen to us." "I'm listening," I said flatly, bracing myself for whatever guilt trip they had prepared. "Your sister, she's in trouble," she said, a hint of frustration leaking through. "We need your help." I felt a pang of sadness, but not for them. For my sister, Emily. She was just a kid, trapped in the same web of neglect and pressure that I had been caught in years ago. I didn't know her, but I could imagine how lost she felt. "She's your daughter," I said, my voice cold. "You need to help her. That's not my job." "We've tried, Alex," my dad cut in, his voice sharp with frustration. "But she's impossible, just like you were." That did it. The anger I'd held back for years bubbled to the surface. "I wasn't impossible," I snapped. "I was just a kid who needed love and attention. You didn't want to give me either, so you sent me away. Now you're doing the same thing to her." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear them processing my words, trying to come up with an excuse or justification, but there wasn't one. "She needs you, Alex," my mom finally said, her voice trembling. "We need you." "No," I said firmly. "You need me to fix your mistakes to make you look good. I won't do it." I hung up before they could respond. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but for the first time, I felt like I had said everything I needed to say. Aunt Linda stood nearby, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "You did good, Alex," she said softly. That night, I lay in bed, thinking about Emily. It wasn't her fault she was caught in this mess, but I couldn't be the person to save her. Not yet. I could barely save myself from the damage our parents caused. Still, I hoped she'd find a way out, just like I did. The days turned into weeks. My parents' attempts to reach me grew fewer and fewer. Aunt Linda and I fell back into our peaceful rhythm. The farm, the quiet evenings, the simple joy of being a family. But one afternoon, everything changed again. Aunt Linda got a call from my grandparents, my mom's parents. They had heard about what was going on with Emily. They wanted to talk to me, to hear the truth about why my parents had sent me away all those years ago. When I told them everything, they were silent for a long time. Finally, my grandmother spoke, her voice heavy with regret. "I'm so sorry, Alex. We should have known. We should have done something." "It's okay," I said, meaning it. "I'm okay now." But they weren't going to let history repeat itself. They decided to fight for custody of Emily. They didn't want her to go through what I did. A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. Maybe Emily still had a chance. My grandparents moved fast. It felt like one day we were just talking about helping Emily, and the next day, they were already working with lawyers. They were determined to pull her out of the mess my parents had created. I didn't know how to feel. A mix of hope and sadness churned inside me. I knew that this was the right thing, but I also knew how hard it was going to be for Emily. She had spent her whole life under our parents' roof, wrapped in the chaos they created. Even if that world was toxic, it was still the only one she knew. Change would be terrifying for her. A few weeks later, my grandparents got temporary custody. Emily was moving in with them. Aunt Linda and I were sitting in the living room when we got the call. I remember Aunt Linda's eyes lighting up with relief, her hands gripping the phone just a little tighter. "It's happening," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. "She's out of there." I took a deep breath. "Maybe she has a shot now." "She does," Aunt Linda assured me. "You did too, remember? And look how far you've come." But Emily wasn't like me. I'd spent years fighting to be noticed, fighting to be worth something. Emily had grown up getting everything handed to her: attention, money, freedom, all without discipline or guidance. I worried that she wouldn't understand what was happening, that she'd think everyone was just trying to punish her. My phone buzzed the next morning. It was a message from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Emily." I stared at the screen for a long moment. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. Finally, I typed back, "Hey, how are you holding up?" Her reply was short. "I don't know. Everything's weird." I could almost hear the confusion in her words. For her, This must have felt like her world was unraveling, but at least she was talking to me. That was something. Over the next few days, we texted more. Emily's messages were hesitant at first, like she was testing the waters. She told me about how strange it was living with our grandparents, how different their house felt. She said they didn't let her do whatever she wanted. No more endless pocket money. No more running wild. But they also listened to her, something our parents had never really done. Slowly, I felt a bridge forming between us. It was shaky, but it was there. She started asking me questions about what life had been like for me after I left. I told her the truth about Aunt Linda, the farm, and how I finally felt like I belonged somewhere. She didn't say much after that, but I could tell she was thinking. One evening, she called me. It was the first time I'd heard her voice in years. "Alex," she said quietly, "why did they send you away?" Her question hit me in the gut. I'd spent years trying to answer that for myself. "Because they didn't know how to handle me," I said finally. "They thought getting rid of me would fix everything." She was silent for a moment. "Do you hate me?" Her voice cracked, fragile and uncertain. My chest tightened. "No, Emily. I don't hate you. None of this is your fault." She sniffled, and I could hear her trying to hold back tears. "I didn't know they told me not to talk to you because you were bad. But you're not bad. You seem good." I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of sorrow and relief. "I'm trying to be," I said softly. "And you can be too. You just need the right people around you." We talked for an hour that night. It wasn't easy. There were long silences and broken sentences, but it felt real. For the first time, I felt like I had a sister, someone who might understand, who might share the same hurt and confusion I'd carried for years. The days blurred together as we kept talking, kept trying to untangle the mess our parents left behind. Emily started to open up more. She told me how lonely she'd felt, even when our parents gave her everything she wanted. How the cigarette incident wasn't just a random act of rebellion. It was a cry for help. She didn't know how to explain it, but I understood. I knew that kind of emptiness. Our grandparents were patient with her. They set rules, but they also offered love. It was like watching a plant start to grow after being trapped in the dark for too long. Emily was beginning to change, to see the world beyond the small, suffocating bubble our parents had built around her. But my parents didn't go quietly. They fought the custody battle with everything they had, not because they wanted Emily back, but because they didn't want to lose face. Their pride was more important than their daughter's well-being. It was painful to watch, knowing they were willing to fight harder for appearances than they ever did for their children. But my grandparents were relentless. They had the truth on their side, and the court saw it too. Full custody was awarded to them. The day it was finalized, I felt like a weight had been lifted. Emily was free, just like I had been, all those years ago. We were both scarred, but now we had a chance to heal. That night, she called me again. Her voice was lighter, almost hopeful. "Do you think things will get better?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, smiling. "I think they already are." In the weeks after the custody battle was settled, everything felt strangely calm, like the storm had passed, and we were finally standing in the quiet aftermath. Emily was adjusting to life with our grandparents, learning what it meant to have structure and real love. It wasn't easy for her. Habits don't change overnight, but she was trying, and that was more than enough. We talked almost every day now. Sometimes it was light and easy, just her telling me about her new school or what Grandma made for dinner. Other times, we talked about the harder stuff, the confusion, the hurt, the years we both lost. It felt good to finally share those feelings with someone who understood. We were two branches from the same broken tree, trying to grow new leaves in better soil. One Friday evening, I was back at Aunt Linda's, helping her with the last of the day's chores. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting everything in gold and purple. The air was warm, carrying the smell of earth and hay. It was the kind of peace I'd learned to cherish. As we leaned on the fence, watching the sky darken, Aunt Linda turned to me. "You've done a good thing, Alex," she said softly. "For yourself and for Emily." I nodded, feeling a warmth in my chest. "I just hope she finds her way." "She will," Aunt Linda said with quiet confidence. "She has people who care about her now. That makes all the difference." And she was right. For so long, I'd thought my survival was a fluke, a lucky escape. But it wasn't luck, it was love. Aunt Linda's love had been the foundation I needed to rebuild my life. Now, Emily had that too, from our grandparents and, hopefully, from me. A few days later, Emily surprised me with a call. "Can I visit?" she asked, a little nervous, like she wasn't sure if it was okay to ask. I smiled. "Of course. This is your home too, if you want it to be." When she arrived the following weekend, I saw a different version of her. She still carried the echoes of our parents' influence, the guarded expression, the hint of defiance, but there was something new in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, a spark of curiosity. Aunt Linda welcomed her with open arms, just like she had welcomed me all those years ago. Emily took in the farmhouse, the open fields, the animals. "It's so quiet here," she said, almost in awe. "Yeah," I replied, "it's a good kind of quiet." We spent the day showing her around the farm. She laughed when the goats tried to nibble on her jacket and marveled at the way the wind rustled through the tall grass. In the evening, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Aunt Linda and I had shared so many dinners. Emily looked relaxed, her walls slowly crumbling. Over dinner, she asked, "Did you hate it here when you first came?" I thought back to that scared, angry 8-year-old boy who had arrived with a suitcase full of hurt. "Yeah, at first," I admitted, but it didn't take long for me to realize this was where I was supposed to be. She nodded, understanding more than I had expected. "I think I know what you mean." After dinner, we sat outside. The night sky stretched out above us. The stars were bright, scattered like tiny lights in the darkness. Emily leaned back on the porch steps, staring up. "Do you think Mom and Dad ever loved us?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy and raw. I thought carefully before I answered. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe in their own way, but love isn't just a feeling, it's what you do. And they didn't know how to show it." She sighed. "I wish things were different." "Me too," I whispered. "But we can't change them. We can only change ourselves." She nodded, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "I'm glad I have you," she said softly. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I'm glad I have you too. For so long, I thought I had lost everything when my parents sent me away. But now, sitting next to my sister, I realized I had gained something more valuable. I found love, family, and a sense of belonging, things they could never take away from me. When Emily left the next day, there were no tears, just a quiet understanding. She knew she could come back any time, that this place was part of her now too. The farm was quiet again, but it didn't feel lonely. Aunt Linda smiled at me as we watched Emily's car disappear down the road. "You two are going to be okay," she said, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Story 3. The story is called Golden Child. Our parents preferred my brother, who got my fiancée pregnant. Their golden child caused them to lose everything 4 years later. Hence, they came pleading for assistance. Hello, everyone. I need your help before we delve into today's video. One of the best ways you could help us is via subscription. We have seen the channel is losing some momentum. It's simple, free, and it keeps us always producing fantastic material for you. Your helping hand means the world. Let us keep this channel expanding together. Thank you very much. Let us therefore begin the video. Hi, Reddit. I never considered myself to be the kind of person who posts on here about my personal life. I must express this nevertheless since I am at a breaking point. I have always known that the golden child was my brother Kyle, 21, male. Even as small children, it was clear he was always handled differently by my parents, especially by my mother. Should his castle of blocks topple, he would cry. Mom would spend an hour sitting with him, hugging him, and reminding him he was delicate and needed extra attention. Me as well. I would be advised to get my mess cleaned and stop being a baby. Early on, I discovered that the rules applied differently to him and me. To their eyes, Kyle was always unique. Mom claimed it was because Dad harbored all these fantasies of Kyle being a doctor, and he was sensitive. For my dad, I suppose it was about living vicariously through him. Though he never made it through college, Dad had always dreamed of being a doctor. His second attempt at that ambition was Kyle. I was only Michael in the meantime. I lacked sensitivity or unique quality. I was the youngster who remained out of trouble, had decent marks, and asked little. Like Kyle, I didn't need hand-holding. Hence, I was disregarded. Until high school, when I had a full scholarship to study computer technology, it didn't truly hit me how deep it ran. At last, I considered, This will be something they are proud of. Who wouldn't be glad about their child getting a full ride to college, really? I still recall the precise situation. I was standing in the kitchen clutching the letter when I told my parents. Glancing at it, my mother nodded and remarked, "That's great, honey." Later on, Kyle needs aid with his med school applications. That's it. That was the degree of compliments I received for working hard to qualify for a scholarship. Kyle, meanwhile, was in high school and hardly passing C's in biology. But you would have thought he would have cured cancer the way my mother pushed him. It was not only intellectual, though. Everything in my life felt smaller than Kyle's. For instance, I was really crazy over heels when I first started seeing Ashley in her senior year. She was great, and my first committed relationship. Ashley was the kind of person who, simply being around her, would help you relax. She worked part-time at a salon while still in high school, and even back then she was focused on saving for the future. She was knowledgeable, pragmatic, and greatly concerned about me. But my folks didn't give a damn. They wanted no meeting with her. As Thanksgiving approached that particular year, "Could Ashley come along?" I asked. Mom said, almost literally, "It's just high school puppy love. Not make it a huge issue. That pain." I wanted my parents to see what I had seen and know her. But no, Ashley wasn't significant enough. Though every one of his girlfriends was treated like royalty, Kyle was. They were often at family gatherings, picking bits of handmade pie, and my parents would flutter over them like they were already daughters-in-law. One night, I sat at the dinner table listening to Mom interrogate Kyle's girlfriend about her aspirations and job goals. I was simply sitting there wondering where Ashley's passion had disappeared to. Still, Ashley and I found it workable. She stayed behind saving money and working at the salon while I attended college on scholarships. 2 years of long-distance weekend video conferences and trips when I could make them feasible. We hung on to one another. Though not simple, we were creating something. Last summer when I proposed to Ashley, it felt as though everything had been well worth it. We were in a little park close to her apartment, and I had saved enough to get her a basic but lovely ring. When I asked, she started to cry. We laughed through tears since we were so very delighted. I felt for the first time that my life was at last headed forward. Surprisingly, once I proposed, my parents seemed to embrace Ashley. Like a switch turned on in my mother's head, Ashley abruptly belonged to the family. My mother even began probing her about dress choices and wedding arrangements. At the time, I saw this as evidence that my parents were approaching, that perhaps they were at last beginning to see me, not just Kyle, but also others I ought to have known better. Thanksgiving returned, and this time I went home eager. I intended to begin discussing the future and tell my family about the wedding, perhaps even demonstrate to them my performance both with my internship and in the classroom. For me, it felt like everything was at last beginning to line up. I then picked up the book. Ashley supplied it. From nowhere, "I need to speak. Starbucks. Important." Though I tried to ignore it, I felt something like sinking in my gut. I reasoned that her worries regarding the wedding were just normal. When I arrived at the Starbucks, I will always remember her look. Like it was the only thing keeping Ashley grounded. She was seated at a little corner table, clutching a coffee cup with both hands. She would not glance up at me. I sat down, and before I could even probe what was wrong, she blurted it out. "I am a pregnant woman. It's Kyle's." Those are like a punch to the chest. I thought I couldn't breathe for a second. I assumed I had misinterpreted her. Hoping I'd heard it wrong, I really asked her to repeat it, but not at all. She expressed it once again. Trying to explain, she began to cry. She alleged it occurred over the summer, while Kyle continued showing up at her salon. He would discuss my distance and the loneliness she must have endured. She claimed it simply happened, but she had no idea how it started. She continued repeating she didn't mean for it to go that far, apologizing. I didn't yell. I remained calm. Instead of becoming enraged, I merely sat there fixating on her. 1 minute later, I stood up, got my keys, and left. Nothing was said to her by me. I left shortly. After Ashley dropped that blow at Starbucks, I recall not much of the drive back home. My brain seemed to have disengaged from the rest of my body. The radio was tuned to something. Though it was just noise, most likely one of those overplayed popular songs. I remained silent. I didn't scream, simply felt hollow. Dark outdoors by the time I arrived at my folks' place. Parking in the driveway, I briefly sat there staring at the porch light. It felt strange, like I was going to enter a dream in which logic vanished. I needed answers even though I wasn't sure if I was really ready to see Kyle or my parents. The second I spotted him as I entered the home. Head down, Kyle was slumped in his shoulders while seated on the couch. His hallmark action was that one, head down like a young child discovered stealing cookies. Patting his back and providing him tissues, my mother was hovering about him. She looked anxious, as though Kyle was the victim here. Yet she was not sobbing, not speaking. My dad was standing next to the window with arms crossed. He gave the impression of evading the whole matter. The room's suspense felt stifling. Everyone seemed to have been waiting for me to arrive, like the last piece of a somewhat disorganized puzzle. What the devil is this about? Though it still broke through the quietness, my voice came out less than I intended. First to talk was my mom. Michael, let us calmly sit down and discuss this. Composed. That word launched me right away. Calm was not what I wanted. I was looking for the truth. I wanted to find out how the woman I had intended a life with, my fiancé, ended up pregnant with my brother's child. Not tell me to be composed. I fixed my gaze squarely on Kyle. You should be the one chatting. Speak first. Kyle looked down. He barely murmured something into his chest. What? I said louder this time. Get involved. Like she was his attorney, my mother leaped in. Michael, you are owning your actions. For him, this is a significant stride. He will be a dad. What I was hearing defied belief. This was a significant step toward some accomplishment for which I should have praised him. I chuckled, but it was not the kind of humorous laugh. It tasted sour. A father, not even able to pass a basic biology course is he. And today, you believe he is ready to start a family? Turning to face my dad, I said, still fixated on the window. He seemed unconcerned about any of this. Dad, you say nothing at all. Turning to me, my dad sighed at last as if I were the cause of the trouble here. Young people are among them. Errors are inevitable. Michael here. You really have to let Ashley go if you truly love her. Their baby is born here. I urged her to leave repeatedly. Inside me, I could feel resentment bubbling. That answers your problem. I'm supposed to just hand over your son who sleeps with my fiancé like it's no big deal. Speak like that, not at all, Mom yelled. Michael, this is a blessed opportunity. It indicates something. An indication of what? I cut her off since your priceless boy cannot bear any responsibility. That I should be simply turning over and absorbing it. Mom's face grew harsh. While Kyle made a mistake, right now he is acting morally. He's going forward. As a family, we should be supporting him. Collectively as a family, that sentence cracked something in me. In that instant, I understood I belonged nowhere in their family. Not precisely. I was only the backup child, the person who did everything right but never really mattered as Kyle did. I turned to check Kyle once more. Still, he had not spoken once. Not even a flimsy apology. He was unable even to lift his head. You know what? With shaking in my voice, I said, okay, you would like to help him? You are free to. I've finished. I am releasing all of you. Mother seemed startled. Michael, don't say things you don't mean. Not exactly, but I mean it. Said, you have decided upon something. This is him. Always it has been him. I spun around and headed directly toward my room. Though I didn't care, I could hear my mother after me still attempting to calm me down. I started stuffing everything into a suitcase I had pulled from her closet. Garments, notebook, books. I dropped a few things since my hands were trembling so fiercely, but I kept on. Michael, you are rash. Mom spoke from the doorway. Your family here is this one. I turned to face her, and for the first time, I didn't give a damn about her opinion. Not so. You are his family. Many years ago, you stopped being mine. She seemed ready to cry, but I felt nothing negative. No more. My dad had turned up too by the time I finished packing. He stood close to my mother. His face turned to that same dissatisfied look he always wore when I deviated. You're exaggerating, he said. To reacting? I said again. I'm overdosing. Your son slept with my fiancé. I passed each of them, dragging my bag to the car. Neither of them tried to halt me. Though I knew better, I suppose they believed I would cool off and return. This marked it. That evening, I drove back to university. The travel took 3 hours, and I spent the whole time in silence. Not even did I play music. Once I returned to my dorm, perched on the bed, I fixated on the wall. Everything seemed strange, as though I were seeing someone else's life collapse. I changed my phone number the next morning. I created new accounts and erased every single one of the others. I blocked Ashley's parents and Kyle's as well. Every picture I took of her ended in the garbage. Not even gave them any thought. I cannot. My friends observed I was behaving strangely during the next 2 weeks. When questioned about the wedding, all I will say is, it's off. I would not want to discuss it. That was sufficient to shut them down. I just stayed in touch with Aunt Mary. 1 week later, she texted me. I overheard what happened. I am here with you, nephew. They will come to regret this sometime. Allow me to say trust. I wasn't bothered at the time about whether they regretted it. I simply wanted to fade away. The days following my family's separation seemed to me as though I were drifting in some weird paradise. I was not depressed. I was not offended. I barely knew anything. I only got up now, went through the motions of class, and sat late at night staring at my laptop screen until I was too sleepy to think. I let myself not process what happened since, if I did, I felt as though I could break. I entered fully in robotic mode. Get waking, class for codes. Eat something if memory serves us. Repetition is crucial. I cut off most of my pals' communication. People questioned why I was not bringing Ashley around anymore or what had happened to the wedding. I just responded, it's done. I do not want to discuss it. I didn't feel like sharing the whole utter dumpster fire that was my life with anyone, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I poured myself, like a man possessed, into code and homework. That was the only thing under my control. I had always been decent at programming, but right now, all I had to concentrate on was late into the evening. I began remaining in the computer lab, creating haphazard projects and editing my own scripts just for fun. I was learning new languages or fiddling with cybersecurity software if I wasn't focused on homework. Anything meant to occupy my thoughts? My teachers began to note the time I was devoting. One of them, Professor Adams, who offered a cybersecurity elective, approached me aside one afternoon to find out whether I would be interested in performing any project study. Though he promised it would look great on my resume, he lacked money to compensate me. I answered without really thinking about it. The boost on the resume didn't really matter. I simply needed something to do. The finest thing that could have occurred to me turned out to be working with Professor Adams. Though he had a dry sense of humor and was a no-nonsense guy, he truly knew his business. Learning about penetration testing, vulnerability scans, and encryption systems, I spent every spare second in his office or the lab. For the first time in months, I felt as though I was creating something real, something that cannot simply be snatched from me while I was buried in work. Back home, life was implacably crumbling. Naturally, since I wasn't interacting with anyone, I first knew nothing about it. Then Aunt Mary began making calls. Older sister of my mother, Aunt Mary has always been the family's black sheep. She loved me, but she never really got along with my mother. She couldn't tolerate it anyhow. Seeing how my parents handled Kyle, every now and then she would text or email me to check in. She was the one person I didn't block. She wrote to me around 6 months after I shut everyone off. Kyle failed out of med school. Thought you should be aware of. After learning that, I spent much time staring at my phone. I'm not sure what I ought to have felt. Perhaps vengeance or satisfaction, but all I felt was numb. Of course, he failed out. Not even med school, let alone high school biology, he could manage. I set my phone down and returned to code. Aunt Mary updated me throughout the course of several months. Kyle's failing marks were not shared with my parents until he was expelled from the university. He had burned most of the money my dad had set aside for his tuition by then. First enraged, my parents soon returned to their normal pattern of justifying his behavior. Kyle, according to my mother, needed time to sort himself out and was under too much pressure. My dad condemned the institution for being overly severe. As it happened, Kyle never worked for anything in his life, so he simply gave up when things became tough. Kyle dropped out and then returned home. For the first few months, he sat about doing nothing while my folks patted him. My mother offered explanations for his lack of output. My dad kept talking about second chances while he was still processing everything. Ashley has a tiny daughter born in the meantime. She was parenting her on her own, largely since Kyle seemed unable to get motivated to get up. Though Aunt Mary claims that mainly meant my mom nagging him until he spent an hour or two with his child, he occasionally helped. Hearing all this made no difference to me. Actually, it strengthened what I already understood. No matter how poorly Kyle botched things, my parents would always pick him. I was constructing my own life, meanwhile, while they were preoccupied with his mess. A company interested in the cybersecurity software I had helped create with Professor Adams had a job offer waiting for me by the time I finished. They so loved my work that they volunteered to let me join as a junior developer with company equity. I accepted the job and relocated to a new city far from all I had left behind. During the startup's first several months, things were difficult. Living off instant ramen, I was working 12-hour days and collapsed on a mattress on my apartment floor. But I didn't give a damn either. I was doing something important. I was part of the real promise that the program we were creating possessed. After an especially demanding day, one night Aunt Mary sent another note. Kyle now works at the Target. Mom has concerns about him. They are clueless about what to do. I read the message, then set down my phone and fixed my gaze on the ceiling. It wasn't as though I was shocked. Having spent his whole life told he was unique, Kyle was now confronting the reality he wasn't. Though I knew it wasn't my issue, I felt strange. Not terrible. Precisely, simply weary. That evening, I didn't answer Aunt Mary. I ran, not sure what to say. 1 year later, my company launched off nicely. Some investors noticed the program we had created, and suddenly, we were expanding more quickly than any of us had anticipated. Being promoted to lead developer came with a significant pay increase and enough funds for a decent apartment. I sensed for the first time in years that I was in charge of my life. My family crossed my mind less and less. I was okay with it, as they were no more part of my environment. Though Aunt Mary still paid occasional visits, I never asked about Kyle or my parents. I was not interested in knowing. My phone then rang 4 years after I left that house. When my phone called, I didn't know the number. Nevertheless, something in my gut compelled me to answer. Not a number I had kept, and these days I hardly receive any arbitrary calls. Most people emailed or Slacked me. I thus froze when I picked up and heard my mother's voice on the other end. Michael remarked, her voice broken like she had been crying for hours. Michael? I am it. Kindly refrain from hanging. I had to find my voice a second. How did you come upon this number? For over 4 years, I hadn't spoken to her or anybody else in my family. I had made sure they couldn't find me, but apparently she had managed it. Aunt Mary helped me understand it. She confessed, "Please pay close attention to me. We appreciate your assistance. Everything has been challenging." That word seemed like a terrible understatement, but I said nothing at all. I sat there clutching my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Right then, I should have hung, but I couldn't. Why is it not clear to me? Perhaps I wanted to hear her out. Perhaps a dumb bit of me was wondering about their preferences. What's going on? I asked precisely, though I didn't care. My tone was colder than I had meant. Mom sighed shakily, and her words poured out like she couldn't control them anymore. Michael, we find ourselves in hot water. Your father's health is not great. Twice this year, he visited the hospital for heart problems. We had to sell the house to pay for Kyle's sins. Kyle made mistakes, I said again. Though I understood I shouldn't have asked, I couldn't stop myself. She paused briefly, then shot it all out. Apparently, Kyle borrowed $40,000 for a business proposition a friend presented. Mom didn't mention what it was, most likely because she didn't know or didn't want to own how foolish it sounded. Still, it failed in a month, totally cleaned out. My parents intervened, drawing on their retirement funds to try to save Kyle from loan default. That, with some of Dad's medical expenses, drove them to sell the house. Naturally, Kyle moved with them when they settled into a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. Where else would he be going? Michael, we are out of everything. Mom claimed her speech sounded thin, as though she was struggling to suppress tears. Kyle is making an effort. He has been searching for employment, but not specifically for anything. I stopped, the wrath seething under the surface level. Mama? Kyle's age is 24 years old. This is a grown dude. Why are you still scrubbing his messes, considering that we are his parents? She snapped like that and clarified everything. She softened once again at last. Michael, we need you. We depend on you. Though I kept my voice calm, my chest tightened. Why ought I assist you? I probed. 4 years ago, you made it rather apparent where I belonged in this family. That is not fair. She spoke swiftly. Back then, we had nowhere to turn. Kyle corrected a mistake. Still, he is attempting right now. Trying? He is still living off of you, then? Like he always has, I said. On the other side of the telephone, there was protracted quiet. Her respiration sounded to be unsteady and irregular. She said at last, Michael, please. Your father's health is poor. I'm not sure what to do. We are left nothing. I sighed deeply and closed my eyes. For a while, I visualized what they must look like today. Dad, gray and slumped over, gazing out the window of some small apartment. Mom wrung her hands and paced the room. Kyle, head down, seated on the couch. Like that evening 4 years ago, though I felt awful for them, it was practically too easy to visualize. Not entirely. I was fatigued. This seemed to be the logical end of the decisions they had taken. You selected him? I murmured silently. You had options and you went with Kyle. You are living with it right now. Michael? I severed her off course. I have nothing to give you. Hello, Mother. Goodbye. Before she spoke another word, I hung up the phone. As I laid it down on the kitchen table, my hands trembled. I watched it for some time, half expecting her to phone back, but she didn't. 60. I didn't sleep that evening. Sitting on my couch in the dark, I kept going back over the chat in my thoughts. I reminded myself I had no interest. I reminded myself they were simply reaping what they had produced. No matter how many times I tried to persuade myself, though, I couldn't get rid of this emptiness. It wasn't shame. I had no pity for them. But listening to my mother's voice, she seemed quite frantic. It set something in me that I wanted no more dealing with. I saw Aunt Mary the following day. You would call me after that, I figured. On the other end of the telephone, she said, I could hear her drinking coffee. Your mother mentioned she intended to get in touch. From you, she obtained my number? I asked, failing to sound upset, but trying. Relax, young man, Aunt Mary said. I handed it to her not. She had to have pulled it out some other route. You know, Mother, she is not easy to give up. I sighed and dabbed at my face. How dire is it, Aunt Mary? Absolutely. She took a slow inhale. It is negative. Michael, the heart of your dad is different from what it used to be. They're also flat broke. Kyle here. You are aware of Kyle, then? He still awaits life to present him with something on a silver platter. Your mom doesn't know how to handle any of it. Your parents are barely squeaking by. She ought not to have to cope with it, I murmured harshly. Kyle had to. Indeed, Aunt Mary pointed out that some people never grow up. We chatted for a while more, and when I hung up, I felt exhausted. I valued Aunt Mary's lack of sugarcoating of anything, but I grew increasingly cut off from my parents after learning about the mess they had gotten into. After 4 years of living a life they had nothing to do with, I had been establishing a life for myself, and now they wanted me back to mend everything. I planned not to do it. I was unable. I put myself into work even more rigorously during the next few weeks than I had. I had plenty to keep me busy as my firm was expanding and we were releasing a major software update. I said to myself I was good. I knew nothing, and my parents were not my duty. But late at night, when the flat was silent and my imagination had nowhere to go, I kept hearing my mom's voice. We will need your assistance. Aunt Mary quickly filled in the voids my mother had omitted for me. Following that call, I would periodically text her. Not because I wanted to know about them, but rather because, when you try to suppress curiosity, it has a funny way of chewing at you. 1 week after the call, I suppose I wanted to see how terrible things had gotten, like peering at a car disaster on the side of the road. An email from Aunt Mary reached me. Thought you should be aware of? Your parents put their car for sale? Kyle was looking for fresh investing possibilities. God is in charge of what? After they let it go, your mother shed for hours. That line caught me over my morning coffee, and I shook my head. I should not have taken great surprise. Auctioning their car? That sounded to be the kind of thing my parents would do. Bending backwards to help Kyle for the millionth time. There is nothing bad the golden child could do, even throughout his running them into the ground. As the weeks went by, Aunt Mary told me more. Kyle had attempted to enter still another company endeavor. Apparently, he was persuaded by an old friend that he might generate thousands of sales of rebuilt devices online. It proved not to work out. Certainly it did not. Kyle had no idea how to run a business. Hence, within a month, the entire thing collapsed. Not before he had asked my parents to assist in his investment in it, though. They lacked the means to save him this time, not after selling their house, already lost, and their car. When they answered no, Aunt Mary told me Kyle went on a fit, like a young child who had been turned away from sweets at the grocery. Though she still tried to comfort him, my mother said, "We'll figure it out, sweetheart." Not to panic. If it hadn't been so dismal, it would have been practically humorous. I continued to advance in the meantime. The year my business was in was among its greatest yet. Our established program attracted a lot of interest, and I was beginning to travel to see business associates and investors. I moved up to a larger apartment and got a new car. At last, my life felt like it should. Something I developed from the ground up, free from family permission or involvement. I kept my family under wraps at work. To them, I was simply another man who had worked hard and become lucky. Perhaps also, it is what I was. 3 months or so after that phone chat, Aunt Mary emailed me one day. This one landed more forcefully than the rest. Your dad paid another hospital visit. Once more, heart. He's consistent, but it terrified your mother half to death. She won't say it aloud, but I believe she knows she has few choices. After reading that, I sat there gazing longingly at my phone. Even though he wasn't really loving or friendly, my dad had always been the kind of man who seemed superhuman when I was a child. He had a steadiness about him. It seemed odd to me to think of him as unwell, weak even. I didn't get in touch, though. Not able to. About 1 month later, Aunt Mary gave a call. Her phone calls were not like this. Usually she only texted or emailed, so I knew something was wrong. On the second ring, I replied, "Hi, Aunt Mary," I mentioned. "What's wrong?" She sighed at the other end. "Your parents resemble less than I would have imagined." "Now what?" I inquired. "Your mother went without a job," she declared. "At this point, they are surviving off leftovers. Your dad's health makes him unable to work anymore. And Kyle also. Well, you know Kyle, he's still home, jobless, sitting on his ass while they try to make rent." I didn't reply. "Michael, what should I say?" After a silence, Aunt Mary said, "They are hungry. I know your mother won't tell me straightforwardly. She asks often whether I have spoken to you, throwing subtle hints. She probably expects you to arrive riding in to save the day. They have nothing to do with me," I answered softly. Aunt Mary answered, although she doesn't see it that way. We sat silently for a few moments before she said, "I'm not telling you this to guilt you, Michael." Simply said, "You should be aware. I appreciated you informing me." She said, "You're doing great for yourself. Keep from allowing them to drag you back into their mess." I said not to do, and I meant it as well. I became inquisitive enough at this point to search Kyle online. I hadn't bothered him in years. Blocked accounts, no buddies in common, nothing. Still, I wanted to know more. Opening a secret browser, I entered his name onto Facebook. His profile remained open for public view. He posted last a couple of weeks ago. A picture of him seated on the couch of my parents, sporting sweatpants and clutching a video game controller. The caption is, "Leisurely taking things easy." The fleeting nature of life, you know? I felt uncomfortable reading the comments. His former buddies were still gassing him. "Man, you are entitled to a break. You will get there shortly, buddy." Closing the tab, I feel disgusted. Having done nothing in his life, how could he still have people supporting him? My parents were giving all they had to keep him afloat in the meantime. Though I considered it, I decided not to email Aunt Mary a screenshot. There was no purpose. A few months later, the business I was employed by closed a big deal. Enough of the dividend from my stock share would have set me up for years. I enjoyed a great supper, celebrated with some colleagues, and then returned to my peaceful apartment. That evening, I sat on my couch considering how far I had come. I had all I had strived for: freedom, stability, a career I felt proud of. Still, regardless of the distance I attained, part of me still felt the weight of my family. I specifically missed them not quite. The concept of a family escaped me, a family who would have chosen me when it counted, supported me, and would have been proud of me. That was not my family, though. I wrote Aunt Mary that evening, "For everything you have done for me for the past few years, thanks. Without your backing, I'm not sure where I would be. I hope you're doing well. Tell me whether you ever need anything." She answered somewhat instantly. "Thank you, Michael. I'm proud of you. Continue developing your life. I would be okay. You are queen as well. You have to cease gazing backwards at some time. You have to let go of the belief that different things may have happened." My parents decided upon their paths. Kyle made his and I made mine. I owed nothing to them. I had turned away from my family almost 5 years ago. Still, occasionally it seemed like yesterday. The disorder, the transgression. That evening I started packing and headed off. I kept those memories close at hand, not because I hadn't healed, but rather because those events molded me. My life looked nothing like it had in those days by now. My company has developed much beyond anything I could have ever dreamed. Our startup was no more scrappy. In cybersecurity, we really were a player. I was in a situation that I could spend my time doing whatever I pleased. I moved whenever it suited, worked on concepts I cared about, and made investments in fresh projects. 1 year ago, my house, a sleek, peaceful haven, felt like a refuge. I hardly needed anything to make me happy. Enough peace and stability were required. Still, there were times when my history tried to catch up with me, regardless of how good my life grew. One of those evenings happened on a haphazard Thursday night. I received a message request on Facebook as I was closing off daily tasks. Though I checked it out of habit, I used Facebook very seldom now. The mail came from Kyle. I debated whether I even wanted to open the screen for a considerable amount of time. Part of me told to disregard it, simply erase it, and carry on. But I clicked on curiosity as it overcame me. His remarks were brief. "Hey, I'm trying to write things, even though you most likely don't want to hear from me. I apologize for everything. I botched everything. Mom and Dad are not doing well. Just thought you ought to know." I gazed at the words for some time. "I'm sorry for everything." After all these years, he said that he led with an apology toward this. 5 years too late was most likely the situation. I ignored it. I am unable to do it. That evening, I lie in bed considering my brother. Not because of what he did with Ashley, but rather for everything else. Kyle was always the person I most hated. The way my parents brought him everything on a silver platter, how they raised him, the way he seized and seized and seized without ever returning anything. Not only did Kyle let me down, it was my parents as well. Now they were paying for the person he had grown to be. They had shaped him. Still, it was not my issue now. Aunt Mary gave a call the next morning. Usually, she hardly called unless it was really necessary. I responded right away then. "Michael, it is your dad." She claimed her voice was quieter than normal, like she was tuning herself for my response. "He experienced still another cardiac crisis. It's terrible this time. They doubt he will ever recover." I went down to my kitchen table, words sinking in are what I mean. I ran, not sure what to say. "Her mother is messy." Aunt Mary stayed on. "She is not handling it well. And, Kyle, well, you know Kyle." Though she couldn't see me, I nodded. "She wants me to do what?" "She has not mentioned anything," Aunt Mary answered. "But you know her, though. She might be expecting you to show up there and to be momentarily present." I considered that. I considered going back, perched at my dad's side, at death. Seeing Kyle and seeing my mother, perhaps their perspectives would change this time as well. Perhaps they would regret their treatment of me. Then I knew, though, that that was not what I desired. I had no desire for closure. I wasn't expecting them to be contrite. I had long since made my peace. I said at last, sad to learn about Dad. "Still, Aunt Mary, I am not returning. I'm unable." She made no attempt to dispute me. I computed as much as necessary. "You've done what you needed to," she said. "Michael, stop feeling bad about it." I answered, "Not sure," and it was the truth. 1 week later, my father was dead. To let me know, Aunt Mary emailed me. She informed me there would be a modest funeral, mostly family, a few neighbors as well. Of course, Kyle was there, standing just as if nothing had changed. My mom's companion. I left absent. I gave some thought to it. Ultimately, though, I came to the conclusion that showing there would cause more damage than benefit. I did not want to pretend differently. I had nothing to say to them. Years ago, whatever I could have said to my father had been left unspoken. He was gone. Rather, I worked in my office that day completing a fresh project I had been steadily working on. I kept what had occurred to my colleagues secret from everyone. It was just another day. To be honest, I preferred it that way. We appreciate the kalguksu. A few months later, I heard from Aunt Mary once more. This time, it related to my mother. "Michael, she's not doing too good," she told me on the phone. Losing her dad knocked her hard. Also Kyle. Kyle is still Kyle after all. He is living with her, but not contributing. She struggles to pay the bills. I inhaled deeply and allowed her comments to sink in. And what should I do in her regard? She has not begged for anything. Aunt Mary answered promptly, "I am merely informing you since I felt you ought to be aware of it. Michael, you have nothing owing to her. You have already been sufficient." About Aunt Mary, I valued that. She never tried to guilt me or prod me toward doing something I didn't want to do. She merely left me to choose what to do with the reality she shared. "I will consider it," I said, though I knew exactly what my response was. "You're right, B. I never contacted my mother in the end either. I gave it some thinking several times. particularly in light of Aunt Mary's updates. Still, every time I did, I thought back on how things had been. I thought of how I felt seated in that living room while my parents supported Kyle. I remembered how they treated me as though I were the issue. Some claim family is everything, but I do not think family is all that important. Should they treat you as you value? Should they not, you are free to go. You have permission to put yourself first. I acted in this way. Years later, I still had my life under construction, still going along with people that felt more like family than my blood ever had. I had a house and a job. I no longer hated Kyle's parents or mine. I felt neither bitter nor angry. In one sense, I felt liberated. Sometimes one does not find freedom in winning. It results in leaving. Story 4. This narrative is titled, Working 2 Jobs I Was Paying for My Sister's College. She considered me a failure. Hello, everyone. Before we venture into the video for today, I need you. One of the best ways you could help us is via subscription. We have seen the channel is losing some momentum. It's simple, free, and it enables us to keep delivering you really great stuff. Your helping hand means the world. Let us keep this channel expanding together. Thank you very much. Let us now launch the video. I vividly recall the day 18-year-old female sister Emily entered her dream university. The mansion seemed to be lit from everywhere. My mother let out a yell. Dad gave her a hug akin to his just jackpot win. Emily was already gripping that acceptance letter as if it were made of gold. Tears of the joyous kind. Most likely, the neighbors felt someone had hit the jackpot. And essentially, I suppose we felt we had. Emily was the shining child always. She is smart and tenacious, and she had grand ideas, not to confuse me. She always discussed working as either a CEO or some type of attorney. She had everything arranged, and my parents thought she was 100%. For them, she was their little miracle. The one they believed would carry on doing incredible deeds and raise our family. Me? I was the subdued background pupil. I was not failing or anything. Simply said, I lacked those grandiose fantasies. Unable to afford it, I left college 1 year early and began working full-time instead. Being a technician brought much delight. Fixing automobiles offered me something concrete, a feeling of direction. One day I was saving to get a house, something minor but personal. Thus, this fancy private university my parents couldn't afford disappeared when Emily entered her university. I took great pride in her. I was really as it is. I could, however, also see the wall's inscription. I knew before they even asked what was ahead. It began little. At supper, my mother would drop clues. She would add, shaking her head, "You know, college is so expensive these days. Emily ought to get this chance." Like me, my dad would chime in, disagreeing. The talks then became more targeted. Basically, honey, these are textbooks. One evening, Emily discovered she lacked the funds to purchase her first set of books. My mother overheard and commented, "Can you assist your sister? Just once exactly?" Of course, I answered yes. She needed it. It was about $100. I saw it as not really significant. Eventually, she would pay me back. Family supports. Family correctly? They continued repeating something like that. But simply this once becomes every month. Emily was not on a full scholarship and lacked a part-time job. Her groceries, rent, tuition, and everything else, all of it added up quickly. Not having the money, my parents were always barely scraping by and living paycheck to paycheck. There is nothing wrong with them for that. I can criticize them, though, for passing the load to me. Emily began calling me personally for money not too long ago. It was first minor. "Hey, could you forward me $50 for groceries? I swear I will pay you back next week." It soon became more intense nevertheless. "I don't have enough. My renters do. What I should do is unknown. Would you be able to help?" And then it stopped asking altogether. Simply expected. She sent me a text message. "Rent is due tomorrow. Would you kindly forward it tonight?" To get by, I took 2 jobs. One works throughout the day, and the second late night at a warehouse. My calendar was horrible. I would get up at 5 a.m., work a whole shift fixing cars, gobble down some breakfast in my truck, then go to the warehouse for the night shift. Most evenings, I didn't arrive home until after midnight. The next day, I did it all over once more. Still, I told myself it was only temporary. Once Emily graduates, I would believe all of this will be worthwhile. She'll land a decent job. It will all balance out. I wish I could have believed that. I wanted to think that my giving would help her to construct her future. But the grudges began to surface as the months passed. The thing is this, Emily behaved more like someone not suffering. She behaved as though she were thriving. Her Instagram was full of images of her drinking pricey lattes, heading to brunch with pals, dressing in outfits I could never dream of, affording smart boots, modern handbags, and new phones. Not able to afford anything else, I was sitting in my beat-up pickup eating a dollar menu burger. I first told myself I was overreacting. Perhaps she was merely posting those items for show. Perhaps her buddies covered part of it. She merely laughed it off when I asked her one night, though. "Everyone in the school wears this way," she remarked. "I want to look like I fit in rather than the way I do now." She said nothing about thanks. She left out asking whether I was all right. She merely shrugged it off as though it didn't matter. And really, I began to feel as though I had no importance. Not much better were my parents. They would dismiss me every time I tried to mention how difficult it was on me. "Your sister is here?" "One evening," my mom remarked. "You are doing something excellent here. You ought to be rather happy with yourself." In proud? Not sure what makes me proud. I was postponing my life so Emily would have the one I would never be able to have. For that's exactly what it felt like. I had no savings at all. I couldn't afford to miss time from work. Apart from sleep and work, I had nothing to do. Not only Emily, but also others. That proved to be the challenge. Everyone in my family behaved in this manner. It was the way things naturally flowed. Like my life was somehow less significant since I wasn't meant to do big things like she was. Emily's casual statement over the phone about wanting to study overseas marked the day I understood just how terrible everything had gone. She omitted asking me as well. She said it just as decided upon already. "Though it costs a bit more, this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance." Her voice bright and carefree. "You will work it out, right?" Though I'm not sure why that specific incident started me off, it did. I sat there clutching the phone, my knuckles white, while she rambled on about how fantastic it would be. For me, working extra hard to send her to Europe for a semester seemed like nothing. That evening, I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling. I began to mentally figure out how much of my life I had given her. Years of experience and thousands of money. All of my vitality. Not even I could identify myself anymore. To her, though, Emily saw none of that. I was simply the always working brother, her personal equivalent of an ATM. I reasoned that things would change. I would simply keep my head down, work through it, and everything would turn around. Until that family dinner, I had no idea how mistaken I was. The supper that followed that discussion on Emily's study abroad intentions changed something inside me. Though I was already stretched thin, the idea of having to take up even more hours for something like that drove me to the brink. Still, I said nothing at all. Not to her, not to my folks, not to anyone else. I had grown overly accustomed to silence, to suppress my emotions while others surrounded me and spoke. The way bitterness develops is strange. It first seems like little irritations, something you ignore. Like Emily would do when she would phone me late at night, happily mentioning that her rent was due tomorrow, like it was not particularly important. Alternatively, all dressed as though she were on a red carpet when she uploaded pictures of herself carrying some elegant cocktail alongside her friends. In my small studio apartment, I was eating instant ramen and tried to persuade myself everything was okay. It's all right. She's your sister. It's okay. This is not going to endure forever. It's good. You will solve it. Those ideas were so often what I told myself that I began to believe. I believe part of me was afraid to say how much I objected to the circumstances, as then I would have to face it. I was not yet ready for that. After a double shift, one night I returned home, totally erased. Opening my refrigerator, I discovered half a loaf of stale bread and one bottle of water. Since payday was still 1 week away and my calendar had been so full, I had neglected to buy groceries. Just feeling empty, I sat down at my small kitchen table and stared at the nothingness before me. I grabbed my phone and, as usual when I couldn't fall asleep, slid around Instagram. That's it. Emily's most recent blog entry. She was out with buddies at some rooftop pub, the background glistening city skyline. Her caption said, "Put in great effort. Put more effort on play. Enjoy this existence." Though I'm not sure what passed over me, I felt queasy. Put in great effort? She hardly knew what that meant either. I was working more than I had in my life, and what evidence might I present for it? A broken back? An empty refrigerator? And a goal of purchasing a house suddenly so far out of grasp? Not even could I visualize it these days, and then she was there. loving life, paid for by me. It grew worse with time. Emily's calls to me felt more like a transaction than like a discussion every time. She never found out how I was doing, never shown thanks. Her calls instead usually began with, "Hey, so I have a little favor to ask." Then some fresh spending comes first. She started to wear thin and couldn't cover her reasons. It was always a time period. With a job, classes are simply too much to manage. I swear I will pay you back. Right now, it is just tight. Not as though I'm squandering the money. I need this kind of material. But did she really have to go on another buying frenzy? One more evening out with buddies. She could have produced another costly coffee right at home. Emily didn't really know what tight genuinely meant, I realized. It was an annoyance for her. For me, it was skipping meals and remaining late, worried about my ability to get through the month. One evening, I caught myself snapping. It came about at 11:30 p.m., and then Emily called as soon as my second shift was ending. Though I thought about ignoring it, I knew she would just text me till I picked up. "Hello, Emily." I mentioned already being fatigued. She was not slow at all. "Could you forward $150 to me? I'm short on money, and my buddies and I are headed to this thing." I dropped my phone almost here. "Why? Emily, it is 11:30 at night. You are requesting $150 for an outing? Are you right now really serious?" She said, "Relax," laughing like I was the irrational one. "Only $150. I'll reimburse you at a later date." That line has been heard so often it hardly registered now. I could not hold it in anymore. "Emily, do you even know what my present life looks like? I put in 14-hour days. I skip meals occasionally as I cannot afford them. And you want money to have a party?" She stopped, obviously bored. It's not simply hanging out partying. I have to keep appearances in line. Okay, everybody leaving the school does so. I look strange if I don't. Not sure what infuriated me more, her entitlement or her actual belief that this was natural. I said sharply, "Done." "Emily, I cannot keep on like this." "What do you mean you are done?" Her voice became shrill at once. "I have always benefited from your help. You cannot quit just now." "I can. I will." I back off. "You have to work this out for yourself." I hung up before she could speak otherwise. And I felt for the first time in years like I had inhaled fresh air. Still, it was short since the guilt came in practically right away. Suppose she missed her rent payment. If she truly needed me, what then? I hardly slept in the evening. My mom called the following day. Emily had naturally run right to her. "What is this I find about your not aiding your sister?" she demanded. "She is having difficulty, and you are just going to let her fail?" I was too worn out to argue. "Mom, I'm not able to keep doing this. I am drowning. You fail to see what this is doing to me." She stated as if that would fix everything. "Your sister. You should be looking out for her." I then understood they lacked vision for it. None of them did. Their perspective of me was one of breaking me, not of the sacrifices I was making. I was simply the one who could solve things each time Emily wanted something. But concerning me, who would be of assistance to me? I came up with no response to that. One thing, though, was quite clear. I could not continue to live this way. Something has to alter. I already felt guilty about the family meal that was scheduled a couple of weeks ahead. Emily came back home for her break, and I knew they would discuss her intentions for studying abroad. I wasn't sure how I would manage it. One thing was obvious, though. I was nearing my breaking point and would soon find something giving. Then came the family. I was not even inclined to visit this one. Nearly begging me was my mother. Emily's break residence is her house. On the phone, she had stated, "Sitting down together will be good for the entire family." Lovely. Yes, correct. Every family dinner since Emily entered college has evolved into a full-fledged Emily appreciation evening. My folks would sit there listening to every word she spoke. I was treated more like a component of the wallpaper, though, still, I crumbled. Perhaps part of me wanted them to see my tiredness. Perhaps I hoped they would see my unhappiness. Emily was already under fire when I arrived. She was seated at the table, engaged in confident conversation, as my parents hung about her like she were royalty. As soon as I came through the door, I could hear her. Indeed, I am much considering attending Paris for the program on study abroad. From what I know, everyone is doing. It would change my life. I stopped briefly in the doorway. Paris. She was thus not even striving to be subtle anymore. "Hi, sweetheart. Come visit." When Mom called upon seeing me, she grinned kindly. But in a few seconds, she was again focused on Emily. I mentally braced myself and went to wash up. Emily neglected even looking up when I sat down at the table. She was reading through her phone, perhaps responding to texts or monitoring social media. My mom was immediately peppering her with questions while my dad was preparing drinks. Tell us then more about this initiative. You would enroll in what courses? What city is this? Emily started an animated description of Paris as though it were some enchanted paradise. Mom, this is really a fantastic chance. You have time to study as well as tour museums, culture, and cuisine. It is like learning on a journey. Perfect is exactly what it is. She turned suddenly to grin at me. Big brother, you're going to adore it too. All you have to do is try a bit harder. I needed a second to let her just say sink in. I laid down my fork deliberately. What does this mean? Will I have to put in more effort? Keeping my tone as neutral as I could, I asked Emily to stop, not even thinking twice. Ultimately, someone has to pay for it. It's just for a semester, and given my tuition, it's not really significant. Furthermore, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event. She said it with such casuality, like she wasn't asking me to give even more of my life for her ideal vacation. I turned to face her, then to see my parents. Neither of them uttered a comment. They were merely grinning and nodding in line with what seemed most acceptable in the universe. At last, I said, just how do you feel I should pay for that? I work 2 jobs right now to pay your rent. Emily gave a chuckle. She grinned. You have always been rather a workaholic. What is a little more overtime? Right now, it will be well worth it. Though I'm not sure what cracked inside me, I couldn't hold back anymore. I slanted forward, my voice steady yet austere. Emily, do you really know what it takes for me to work 2 jobs? I chose not to do this. I act since I have no option. And you now want me to cover Paris? The table silence. My mother glanced at me like I had offended Emily. My dad laid down his fork. Emily, meanwhile, rolled her eyes and laughed. Oh my God, cool yourself. Why must you constantly be such a martyr? Not that significant a concern here. She said it at that point, the thing I have burnt into my brain since then. Perhaps you wouldn't be so hostile all the time if your life was not going nowhere. I will swear. Time stood still, like fog smothering me. The words hung in the air. I turned to face her, actually stared at her, and felt something shatter. She had the audacity to look at me like I was the failure after all the years of sacrifice, of weariness, of breaking myself for her aspirations. I'm sorry, I stated softly. I said softly. Emily shrugged, fiddling with her fork as though she hadn't just dropped an explosive. Indeed it is. You are always in motion. You never act or travel any place. Perhaps you ought to quit obsessing over me and concentrate on your own life. Describing what I felt at that moment is difficult. Frustration? Correct? Injury? Sure, absolutely. More than anything, though, was the knowledge that Emily saw me as her brother was not. I was a resource, a wallet, an afterthought. I got up by pushing my chair back. The sound reverberated in the quiet. You assume I am envious of you, Emily? My voice quivering with repressed wrath, I said. Having spent the last 3 years paying for yours, my life is nowhere. I work 14-hour days so you may live in some fantasy, purchase clothing, and party. And you label me as failing. Emily, just what have you done? None at all. Just enough. Trying to stop me, my mom snapped, but I was not done. I looked at my parents. Furthermore, you two. You watched and let this take place. She has been enabled by you. I feel like I don't matter, thanks to you. Since I am not your perfect child. I am done, though. I'm past paying her tuition, her rent, everything. She figures it out on her own. Emily's face turned pallid. You are unable to doing that, she stated. At last, panic tumbling into her voice. How then am I supposed to live? I am going to lose my flat. That's not my concern, I answered bitterly. Sort it out, figure it out. And I took my jacket and left. Emily started crying as my mother yelled something behind me. I turned away. I headed straight to my car, got in, and simply sat for 1 minute. My hands shook, my heart was racing. Still, I felt free, first for years, then for once. I drove home totally silently after leaving that supper. I skipped turning on the radio as well, just sat there, trying to make sense of all that had just happened while staring at the road. Emily's comments kept coming back to me like a broken record. Your life is not headed anywhere. It wounded more than I would have wanted to admit, not because I felt she was correct, but more because, following all I had done for her, it was her impression of me. My phone was already flashing when I arrived home. I looked, but knew exactly who it was. I dropped my keys on the counter, plopped down onto my couch, and sighed deeply as the screen buzzed constantly once more. It started with Emily. Period. What's incorrect about you? You shamed me before everyone, then my mother. You had no right to explode in such a manner. She is your sister. Turning my phone off, I dropped it face down on the table. They wouldn't let me take the time I needed to relax and clear my brain. I woke up the next morning to even more messages. Emily had simply forwarded her sob story to social media. Opening Instagram out of habit, I came upon a picture of her seated on her bed, head in hands, tagged, "When someone you trust most lets you down." Her pals sent encouragement into the comments. "You do not deserve that, sweetheart. Others have no idea what family is. SM, you will get through this, queen." I felt my blood heat. Though the opinions of her friends mattered nothing to me, the sheer gall of her portraying me as the story's villain infuriated me. She kept from them years of paying for everything. She kept from them the extent I had sacrificed. No, she presented herself as the victim only. Simple. Emily, get. I determined then I wasn't going to be playing her game. I refrained from commenting. Text her back instead. I said nothing at all. Allow her to have her outburst. Naturally, though, that was insufficient for my mother. My phone rang at about noon. I let it wind up on voicemail. By the fourth call, she kept phoning incessantly. Not trying to hide the annoyance in my voice, I at last grabbed what I had stated. "What interests you now?" Demand was placed by my mother. She harbored resentment. Rather furious, Emily related to me what happened. "In what way could you phrase such things for her? She is broken." I let a long breath in. Try to remain composed. "Mothers." I said nothing. That falsehood was untrue. 2 jobs have been helping me pay for her life. As she regards me as nothing, I am unable to doing it anymore. She is your sister. She started to snap. You are intended to be her helper. Please assist her. I repeated, my voice getting higher. I had her right under tow. And for me, what has she done? She hasn't once expressed thanks. She asked how I was doing, not once. I gave everything up for her. And you get enraged with me? My mother stopped for a second, silently, probably shocked. At last I was arguing for myself. She then moaned greatly. Her age is young. She does not yet grasp. You have to be really patient. No, I said with great conviction. I have been composed. I have been far too patient. She should solve it on her own at last. She disregarded that. She hung up for the following few days instead, murmuring something about me being selfish. I seemed to be the family's villain overall. Non-stop blowing up my phone was relatives I hadn't seen in years, suddenly feeling compelled to chime in. She's having difficulty. You cannot simply drop her off. Family comes first. You are being quite nasty. I paid them all no attention. Let them pursue their own ideas. I had quit acting as the doormat. Then the call from the landlord arrived. Emily had to have informed him I paid her rent, as he contacted me personally when the money failed to show. The brief and awkward discussion was about this. Hey, I'm looking for Emily's apartment payment. Rent? She does not reside here. You should address that with her, I advised. I felt almost horrible when I hung up. Almost. Still, Emily had put herself in this position. Emily showed up at my flat around 1 week later. I knew it belonged to her. As soon as the furious knocking on my door started, though I pondered not responding, I didn't want her pounding all day. She seemed different as I unlocked the door. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red like she had been sobbing, and she wasn't dressed like her usually put-together self. You cannot just shut me off, she murmured, her voice breaking. Right now? What should I be doing? I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. Try to figure it out, Emily. Employment is great. Sort your funds in a budget. Here in the real world, welcome. She looked at me as though I had just spoken in another tongue. How one does that is unknown. That is not my concern, I answered. She stood forward, begging. Please, only 1 more month now. I swear I will figure out how to reimburse you. I nodded. No, I have heard otherwise. I no longer find myself doing this. Her face creased, and for a moment I thought she might really understand. But instead she turned. You truly are nasty. Tears flooding her face, she yelled. You are meant to support me. That is the nature of family. I sigh. Emily, family does not exploit one another. Though you never tried, you have years to learn how to stand on your own. That falls on you, not me. crying. She said things like, "You don't understand, and you've destroyed my life." But I did not move. She eventually quit. She slammed my flat door behind her and rushed left. Feeling a strange mix of feelings, I watched her walk out through the glass. Reprieve, lowness, wrath. I was not devoid of compassion. I did sympathize with her. But at the same time, I realized if I kept saving her, this was the only way she would have ever known. She couldn't even stand on her own. My mother gave another call that evening. She arrived home sobbing. Her voice shook with disappointment. "How would you treat her?" I drew in a long breath, "Since it is the only way she will be growing up. Moms." She whispered softly, "You're pulling apart this family." I stopped, then said, "No, Mom. I'm just not allowing you all to tear me apart anymore." I felt guilt-free for once. For suburban areas, slap, slap. Things picked up more quickly than I had anticipated following Emily's breakdown in my flat. She wasn't going to let this go gently, but I didn't personally hear from her again. Rather, she discovered alternative means of reaching me via my parents, extended relatives, and even close friends. She seemed to be out on a mission to punish me for challenging her. It began with calls from Mom. She persisted without stopping. I would see her name show up on my phone every day following work, and each day I would send her to voicemail. She alternated between guilt trips and fury. Her notes began with stuff like, "Emily is struggling, and you just don't care anymore. You are tearing up this family." She would then try to play the "I raised you better" card when that proved unsatisfactory. "You were not raised to be such a selfish person, egocentric." I found that word to be really persistent. Was I conceited in wishing my life back? Was I selfish for not wishing to burn myself out once more? The quiet in my flat seemed heavier than usual. One evening, I sat on the couch staring at my ceiling and considered everything. Emily had taken up so much mental space during the preceding few years. I came to see every choice I made, every hour I had worked, every dime I had saved. Her survival dominated all of it. Playing her provider had kept me so occupied that I neglected myself. But Emily? She was acting like Emily usually does, making everything worse for her. The word of Emily's return in with my folks quickly got out there. Of all people, I learned via one of my colleagues. Apparently, Facebook was buzzing over her GoFundMe page. I never followed her, but someone noticed it and mentioned it at work. "Hey, dude, is your sister this?" Shoving his phone in my face, my friend inquired during our lunch break. Sure enough, there it was. Emily staring very ugly. Captioned "Hopeless Times." Unexpected costs have completely turned my life upside down. Anything contributes. Her target was $3,000 and she had already raised almost $200. Her sob tale wasn't quite following her expectations. "What a joke," my friend shook his head and murmured. "She sounds to be a con artist." I hardly answered at all. I felt ashamed. Suddenly wanting to be alone, I grabbed my food and headed to my pickup. When Emily could have worked it out like any other adult, she was out there begging strangers for money. She had alternatives, as I knew. She was still playing the victim even though she had a part-time job, cut back on her expenses, and moved somewhere less expensive. Eventually, word of Emily's circumstances gets to the extended family, and I started receiving calls from folks I hadn't heard from in years. First of all was my aunt, sister of Mom. She said over the phone, like I would have shattered some family artifact, "You have to fix this. Emily's small. She made some errors. You are her older brother, though. You ought to be her mentor." "I oversaw her," I answered back. "For 3 years, I walked her through food, tuition, and rent. She gained nothing of knowledge. How could that be my fault?" On her end, there was quiet. Then she sighed. "Family looks after one another, sweetheart. That is simply how things operate. Family doesn't use one another for gain." I answered strongly, "If you care so much, then you should send her some money." That cut off the discussion rather fast. Emily's circumstances had become far worse from awful. From her, I never heard it. She hadn't spoken to me since the day she stormed out of my flat, naturally. Rather, I learned about it from friends and a couple of nosy cousins, trying to keep appearances, ordering meal delivery almost daily, shopping for new things she didn't need, and acting as though nothing had changed. She had burnt through the remainder of my parents' savings. The bubble collapsed at last. Her credit card maxing out left my parents to handle the debt. Though Emily didn't really learn her lesson, I would want to think she did. She turned even further toward blaming me for leaving her. Emily apparently thought I was the cause her life was disintegrating, not related to her spending patterns, not her entitlement, not her defiance against responsibilities. You have to stop loving at some time. I also did. That terrible family meal a month later, I received a text from my dad. We must discuss. Kindly arrive over. I debated whether I should even bother for a good minute, staring at the mail. Though I didn't want to find myself dragged back into the situation, curiosity won out. Not having seen my parents since that evening, I wanted to know what they would say when I visited their house. How different it felt startled me. The air felt heavy, tight. The stress in the house seemed to have been absorbed by the air itself. Sitting at the table, my dad was stroking his temples as he had been experiencing days of a headache. At the desk, my mother stood, obviously trying not to cry. Emily was nowhere to be seen. Emily is where? I sought, ending the quiet. Looking 10 years older than he had the last time I saw him, my dad's side was she is boarding with a friend. We could no longer manage it. I blushed. Mean what you mean? She ran all of the cards. Softly, with a shaky voice, my mother said, "We are totally out of supplies. She couldn't stay here unless she started paying her own way," we told her. She found it unpleasant. I slanted myself against the chair, processing what they just told me. At last, my parents, who had supported Emily for years, who had let her act at every turn, had reached their limit. There was part of me vindicated. The other part simply felt fatigued. From me, what would you like? I crossed my arms and asked. Looking up at me, my dad seemed both ashamed and desperate. What we should do is unknown. About her, you were correct. We paid little attention. We are drowning now, though, and alone we cannot remedy this. I turned my head and laughed bitterly. After all you've gone through, you think I'm going to bail you out? My mother went forward following all she had gone through. We are not asking for money here, just we. Her is not someone we know how to handle anymore. She's not listening to us. Here at the club, welcome. I shook my head and said, for years I have been attempting to impart just this. You're surprised she's still walking all over everyone now, as you let her. Not saying anything, my dad is. Though she couldn't refute the reality, my mother seemed like she wanted to disagree. They had been justifying Emily for years. It was simpler than making her answerable. Hence, they would let her get away with everything. And today, they were paying for it. Literally and metaphorically. I left shortly after that, not staying very long. I apologized for their difficulty, yet I could not solve their problems. Like Emily, they had to work this out for themselves. Cleaning their filth was no more under my purview. Over the next 6 months, I heard fragments of Emily's life. She burnt relationships the same way she wasted money, bouncing between friends' couches for a while. People became somewhat bored with her actions rather soon. She eventually found herself with no choice but to work a part-time job at a nearby coffee shop. If I claimed not to have a minor sense of gratification at learning, I would be lying. Not so much because I wanted her to suffer as it meant she was at last being compelled to face truth. With regard to me, everything improved. I began to save once more, slowly but definitely, and I at last reached my aim a year later. On the outskirts of town, I purchased a fixer-upper modest house. However, it was mine. Working on it, painting walls, mending pipes, and creating a place I could call home, I spent my weekends. Though not fancy, it wasn't necessary either. I also began reaching out to my pals. I came to see how much I had turned away from the world in order to give Emily everything. I felt lighter now that I lacked that weight hovering over me. Once more, I felt like me. One evening, Emily sent me an SMS. It was succinct and straightforward. Period. Hey, I wanted to apologize for nothing, but till now, I had no idea how much you had done for me. I hope you're doing okay. I gave the screen a lot of long looks. Some of me wanted to reply. I wanted to tell her that was good. I forgave her. Still, another side of me wasn't ready. I wasn't going to risk returning to be her crutch. I had spent too long in that capacity. I set down the phone instead and headed outdoors. Breathing in the cool night air, I discovered something while seated on my porch's steps. I owed her nothing in response. Not right yet. Perhaps eventually I would be ready to forgive her. For now, though, I delighted in simply being free. Eventually, Emily would sort her life out, else she wouldn't. In either case, it became less of my obligation. I had a life of mine to live, and I was at last living it, first